Are you a leader, manager, entrepreneur, business owner, or knowledge worker? Are you leading people or wondering how to be a better leader in your own life and work? If you are, then you can be experimenting better. Welcome to The Experimental Leader, a podcast that takes a look at the ways leaders are experimenting in their own work. Hosted by Melanie Parish, we dive into real-life conversations about how people might be using a scientist's mindset and experimenting in their work. Shift your leadership into something that works better. Join us on The Experimental Leader today.
Hello, I'm Melanie Parish. I am super excited to be here live with you today. And I have been having the most interesting conversations about accountability, both with my clients. I've been thinking about it myself. And I've realized that this is something that new leaders often struggle with. And I think they struggle with it because things kind of get away from them. And I was thinking, I don't really struggle with this so much anymore. And I was wondering why. And I was thinking that part of it is because I've learned how to pass buckets to people so that I actually pass the accountability piece down the line. So they're actually holding me accountable to deadlines and what we want to accomplish and those kinds of things because I've passed a big enough bucket to my people. So the people that are doing work with me, alongside me, I'm passing them the accountability. And so I've sort of learned how to twist accountability upside down. So if you're a leader and you're struggling with accountability, you may want to think about how you take the whole of the project, the problem, and you start to think about how you might pass it to a team member. Now, I'm not saying that you're going to pass that to a team member and then give it to them and never talk to them again and just hope they'll get it done, because you want to play on their team then, and you want to be a resource for them. In fact, we had a thing that I said, gosh, in September, we want to get this done. And it wasn't getting done. And you could think, wow, Melanie, I was thinking I really need to hold them accountable. And so in October, I started doing that for my team. And I was like, hey, why isn't this done? And I started to be sort of cranky. But what I realized by having regular meetings about the thing was that we actually were missing some skill sets and some vision and some strategy. And so no amount of crankiness or force of character was going to have us be accountable to this thing. I mean, we could have done it badly, but what we were actually missing was a person. So we ended up hiring a consultant to help us with a marketing plan and a marketing strategy because we were missing something that was really key as we wanted to try doing something else. So this is all foreshadowing. We'll be doing some cool stuff this in the new year. But it was the accountability piece. Sometimes I think new leaders think if they're just tough enough or they're mean enough or they hold people's feet to the fire, we have all this language for this, then they're going to get what they want. But it's through sort of curiosity and conversation that you might find out you're actually missing expertise or strategy. And that's why work isn't getting done. So it's a much more complex topic, this accountability thing. And I actually think it's more about the leader holding themselves accountable to their curiosity and to watching movement of things they hold dear and important as work and throughput happen with their team. So those are my thoughts about accountability. And I am super excited about my guest today. Today, I'm welcoming best-selling author, speaker, and organizational agility leader, Brandi Olson. And Brandi believes that the only place to do good work is in reality and does her work from St. Paul, Minnesota, where she lives with her husband, 2 kids, 4 chickens, and many honeybees. And she has a new book out in October called Real Flow: Break the Burnout Cycle and Unlock High Performance in the New World of Work. And I am so excited to have you on my show, Brandi. Welcome.
Hello, Melanie. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to join you.
Yeah, thank you for coming, and I can't wait to dive into all that. Before we dive into all of what you're working on, we are doing book club this year on the podcast, and I have a little passage to read from the Experimental Leader book. We're doing chapter 1. We'll be doing a little bit of book club every week on the podcast. And we are on chapter 1, the climate of innovation. And I just want to read a paragraph or so just to put the flavor of the Experimental Leader book in here. As a leader, you know that real intentional change must have stable, supportive organizational structures. Without these, whether seen as upheaval or innovation, change is rockier, less productive, and less energizing for the company and its leaders. Without stability, innovation is expensive. People fight over resources, and eventually they burn out. The experimental leader needs to consider how to establish the stability that will support innovation as we hammer on at breakneck speed. I picked that for you, for you, Brandi.
I love it.
Yeah. It's burnout is definitely important as we talk about tech and leadership. I mean, any business, but especially now. So I don't know what thoughts you've had. I know you did a little reading and pondered how these topics intersect with your work.
Yeah. Well, that passage that you just read was one that stood out to me as I was reading The Experimental Leader. That idea and the relationship between stability and responsiveness to change, I think, is such an interesting paradox and really important to pay attention to. I think about stability, and the word that I often apply to that is discipline. And when we choose to be stable or have discipline in certain parts of our organization's structure is a really good example, that enables us to have flexibility and creativity and responsiveness in other areas of our organization. And I think so often we try to control and predict the change that's happening around us, which is a really futile task. And if instead we spend time focusing on how do we create a stable environment, then we can be released from needing to know exactly what's going to happen 6 months from now. And we can be much more adaptive, experimental, focused on learning. So I think that relationship, right, between stability, innovation, and then how we show up to do our work, I think is really at the core of what it means to be an effective leader.
Yeah, I think it's so important. That alchemy of doing something that's never been done before. I talked about it in the book, but the concept still astounds me when I sort of think about it. We had all these professions that were, accounting, even medicine. Like, we have innovative medicine, but innovative medicine also follows best practices. So and then we have this whole body of work that opened up with tech. And even if you think about entertainment or things like that, doing like the creative world, and all of a sudden we're trying to, reinvent the wheel every day. And the weight of that is sort of, we don't have a world of best practices to go from. My husband and I are the first generation to deal with children who grew up having devices in their hands. You can't think, oh, what did my parents do? My parents let us do whatever we wanted with technology. They supplied some, it was a tool. It was new. They didn't grapple with too much. So I think we grapple with a lot of things. And I think we're only touching on, what it's going to be like to burn out, or how to think about burnout even, is a new topic.
Mm-hmm. Well, Melanie, you said something there that I think is really important, and you started talking about best practices. And I think one of the things that has always been true, but sometimes we wind up thinking that it's not, is that there is a best practice that we can always rely on, that, what worked for that company over there, that family over there will work for me. And I think one of the things we start to see in our current climate and environment and markets is the whatever nugget that we want to still hold on to, that those best practices exist and are known, is blown out of the water, because change is happening so rapidly. The work is changing, the ways we're working is changing so rapidly, that we are forced to let go of that kind of comfort of a best practice. But I think one of the things that's true is there perhaps has never been best practices that work and are right in all circumstances and in all situations. And the idea that there is a best practice is kind of keeping us locked in a level of learning and performance that's limiting. I wrote an essay about this a few weeks ago, the idea that best practices, right, don't exist. And one of the things that resonated for me in reading your book is this idea of learning to do better, right? So I will say, like, definitively, there are bad practices. There are bad practices that will never work and never be good to use. And there are patterns and practices that worked well for others that are a good starting point for our leadership or the work that we're doing. But the idea that there's a best, a right way, while comforting, just gets us really far outside of reality. And I wonder if there ever really have been best practices, but really what we have always needed and what has always worked well is finding those better ways to work.
Well, I think there's some interesting things. Like, there are some repetitive tasks. Like, I'm a knitter.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm really trying to up my game, and I'm upping my game through having a mentor who knows those best practices.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, and this is interesting, because I thought that was going to be that she taught me how to follow a pattern. But she's better than that. So she's not teaching me how to follow a pattern. She looked at a lot of patterns, and then we figured out how to start and what our goal was. And it was still like a target condition, and there's freedom. So we're doing the same exact pattern with the same yarn, but it's two different colors. And she's doing a different stitch than I'm doing, and they will look nothing alike when they're done. We're both making a poncho. And we could wear them together and people would go, wow, those are really interesting. No one will ever think they are the same. And from our point of view, they will be nearly identical, except the stitches are so different that people think the stitches are the thing. So that's that sort of stable bottom with the freedom to create. That's so interesting.
Yeah, well, and that's something simple, right? Knitting, people have been knitting for millennia, perhaps, very long time, right? But what works well for one knitter, well, there may be better practices and there's bad ones. What works well for one knitter may not be the exact same thing that works well for another knitter. Or I'm left-handed, so when I learned how to crochet, very few of the YouTube videos out there were very helpful for me. But understanding the pattern at play allowed me to kind of work backwards from that and figure out what was going to work well for me. And I think that same sort of dynamic exists, whether we're talking about knitting, whether we're talking about like team collaboration, whether we're talking about, leading a large organization of, hundreds of thousands of employees, right?
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the things that's even interesting about that is just like, we have to decide what we do with mistakes. So my guess is her knitting will have not one single mistake in it. I actually, with the yarn that we're using, is really difficult. It's small, and it's 2 threads spun together. So it's really easy to pick up half a stitch.
Mm-hmm.
And I practiced a lot, and I've knit a lot, but it's just a little much. So I've dropped a stitch a couple of times. Now she would probably pull it all out and fix it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to do that. So I will have imperfections in my knitting, which I actually don't mind at all.
Mm-hmm.
And she will not. And so, and we also get to decide as leaders. I mean, I'm just going to throw this in there as leaders. We also have to decide how we handle mistakes. Like, do we live with them? Do we amplify them? Do we talk about them? Are we an example for the people around us? Or do we, work really hard at night to make them go away? We do a whole bunch of extra work to make them go away. So I think that, even in my stupid little, and it is a stupid little analogy to talk about knitting, but even in those things, like there's these little decisions that get made that affect because you're producing something, there's a product at the end. To think about who you are.
Yeah, well, and there's this inherent tension between learning and innovation and predictability and repetitiveness. And I think, as leaders, we crave predictability because it helps us understand deadlines and budgets and inputs and what we're going to need to get the outcome that we want. And if you actually got to live in a world that was super low complexity and change didn't happen very often, you could perhaps build a highly predictable world and company. But if in fact you live in a company that has an environment and a market that's rapidly shifting and changing, and people show up to do the work, to collaborate, you inherently have a super highly complex organization. And that means that change can come from anywhere. It can create unpredictable outcomes. And innovation itself, right, is the outcome of learning. It's inherently unpredictable. And so we have to balance this tension of predictability and innovation. And yet we can't have an organization that is in total chaos, or there's no structure or stability. And I think that's navigating that, creating that environment that finds the right balance between that innovative learning, that predictability, that stability. That's the role of a leader. How much do we need? It might look different at different seasons and different times, depending on what your goals are or your outcomes. But balancing that and creating an environment where people can balance that together, I think that's essential and one of the primary responsibilities of a leader.
Well, and I'm super excited to talk to you about your book, partly because sometimes I experience burnout. I've been coaching for 23 years, and I have to pay attention. So I want to know why you decided to write this book, because I'm guessing there's a story. And I'd love to know more about it. And why is this the book that you wrote?
Yeah, so this is probably a book about burnout that's unexpected and doesn't really take a look at burnout from the exact same direction that a lot of conversations happen, because I really wanted to look at it from the perspective of how does a leader design an organization and lead a team that doesn't cause burnout. And it started for me actually with work that I was doing as I was coaching some executives and teams around their agility and how they were designing their teams. And the challenge that came up, and this is a challenge that I have seen and observed in every single organization I've ever worked with, from a 3-person volunteer-led nonprofit to a multi-global financial institution, which is there's an abundance of important work to do. And we are struggling with the abundance of important work and how to prioritize it and how to get it all done. And it's all important. So what do you do? And that pattern just emerges over and over again. And one of the things that I've taught for a long time is to understand in an organization, when there is an abundance of important work to do, what it looks like to do all of the work at the same time versus, and so in doing so, planning to get started on all of the work versus planning to get done with it, and managing how much work we pursue at any given time. And so as I was doing a lot of research in that space, I would start to draw this graph around what's actually going on in your brain when you're navigating competing priorities. And, we talk about that as multitasking, but what's actually happening in your brain? And what's actually happening in your brain is that you're context switching. You're switching back and forth between all of these things. And the research shows that if you are navigating one project or task, you'll get to spend all of your time doing that task. If you have 2 projects or tasks, you spend about 40% of your brain power just managing the switch back and forth between those tasks. If you have 3 projects, you spend about 60% of your brain power just managing the switch back and forth between those tasks. And you get about 40% of your capacity to actually do the work. And so the reason I bring that up is because as I was working with organizations struggling with an abundance of important work to do and feeling overwhelmed and flooded and burned out by trying to navigate that, one of the realities is many of us are spending the majority of our time during the day, during the week, during the month, just switching back and forth, which is work that doesn't actually help us get to done. I started teaching about that and writing about it, and a friend asked me why I cared so much about it. I call that organizational multitasking, that collective switching back and forth between things all the time. He goes, Brandi, I don't get why you care so much about organizational multitasking. And this is where the idea for the book came. And what I said was, I care because I think we are putting people in positions where they're having to choose between doing good work and their own humanity and well-being. And in most cases, I think that's a false choice. And so this constant switch and overwork and working ineffectively causes some real human suffering. And it's keeping us from using our collective capacity for creativity and innovation and learning. It's keeping us from using that to do the work that matters most. So that's why I wrote Real Flow. I wanted to have a conversation about how does the way we choose our work, how does organizational multitasking, how does that cause and contribute to burnout? And why should we care so much about it? If you're a leader of that organization that's experiencing a lot of burnout or turnover, what's underneath it? And how can we start to have a different conversation about what to do instead?
I am fascinated, and I'm also like, I wonder, and I noticed because I work with so many leaders and executives and how they go from one meeting to another meeting to another meeting, and they're like popcorn.
Yeah.
And me too, because I'm doing the same task, so I'm not clear. And I'm even asking for myself, like, wow, I wonder how that research applies to me. And if I'm talking about the same topic, if I'm always coaching, but I'm coaching people, is it a different topic? Is it like, where does that research go? And I don't know the answer. You may or may not.
I do. So our brains are incredibly great at this sort of thing. Yeah. And so we're super malleable in how we approach that. When you're switching, what your brain's actually doing is it's 2 tasks. One is called goal shifting. So your brain is immediately saying, what was I doing before and what do I need to do now? And the other is rule activation. And what your brain is doing when that's happening is saying, what are the rules of engagement here? It's different when I'm in this conversation with you, Melanie, as we're getting to know each other and having a very public conversation. The rules of engagement there are very different than the rules of engagement when I am facilitating a 30-person design session, right? And so my brain is rapidly adjusting to that. So every time we switch, our brain goes through those 2 tasks and we can't skip them. We can't avoid them. Our brain just does it for us, often without awareness. So our brain can simplify that, right? So coaching all day means you probably have a less active rule activation load because
I know exactly what I'm doing.
Type of task. Now the people are changing. So your brain and your body is going to rapidly adjust to how you engage with that person. But it simplifies like the cognitive load, which means you don't have to spend as many of your calories and oxygen in your brain on understanding the rules of that type of engagement. You get to spend more of your time listening, understanding what's happening, meaning making, right? And so how we manage that context switch is really varied for each person. But what is the same for every person is that our brains all do it, and we can only do it one thing at a time. So I can't actually do rule activation and goal shifting at the exact same time. I can only do it one at a time. And so that means that the more I'm shifting, the more things are changing, the more meetings I'm going to back, the greater my cognitive load is growing, because I can only do it one at a time. And turns out the same part of my brain that's responsible for context switching is also the same part of my brain that's responsible for listening, for communication management, for problem solving, for creativity and analysis. And our brains can only do one of those things at the exact same time.
So what do you recommend? What's the recommendation for that? I mean, it's in your book.
Yeah. So what do you do with that? Right. So it's the reality that we have to understand, because it's just true about humanity. Right. And there's been a load of research and cognitive science backing this up. It's called the bottleneck phenomenon, the thing that means we can only do one of these executive function tasks at a time. It's just true. So my first recommendation is to embrace that reality, because it's a whole lot easier to embrace that reality and move forward than to try to get our brains to do it all at the same time and somehow turn our one human self into something like a machine. It's harder to work against our biology than with it. So it's first just recognizing and noticing that it happens, right? So if you are in meetings back to back all day long and you get to the end of the day and you feel exhausted, it's not because you're not cut out for the work. It's not because you're not a high performer. It's because your brain has been engaged in this unrelenting context switching all day long, and it physically requires more calories, more oxygen, more energy to do that. So from an individual perspective, it starts with just finding ways to consolidate and create space, right? And being aware of it, right? So there's lots of strategies individually around how we can understand how our own brain engages with that kind of context switching. And I will say the answer is not just to do one thing at a time. It might be for you, but it doesn't have to be that. It's more about understanding just how do I work with my brain? How do I understand better how my brain does this type of work so I can work with it? What I'm especially interested in, though, is not how each of us individually manage our task list. I'm especially interested in what's happening when we are part of an organization that is so flooded with competing priorities that we feel there is no other way to work other than to be in a meeting and be checking our email and to be in back-to-back meetings all day long. And what happens when we exist in that environment? And what's an organizational leader to do about that? And how does that scale? How does our individual experience of how we manage our work, how does that scale when we have entire teams or teams of teams or entire organizations that are constantly just engaged in an unrelenting game of context switching all day long? The problems and the challenges there scale pretty significantly. And yet it's still a human problem. And so how we show up as individuals, we have to be able to understand that and then look at it at scale and then come back to we're all made up of individuals and humans and look back and forth and connect the dots there. There's a lot of ways that we can look at that differently, but it starts with recognizing it and seeing it and embracing the reality of it.
It's super interesting. Thank you so much for talking about it. I'm really fascinated by this idea, and I think it's so important. I live and breathe and have people in my ear who are struggling now, more than ever. After the last few years we've been through, people and now when I hear layoffs, in the tech sector, all I can think of is, oh no, they're going to ask more of the people that are left behind. And this becomes even more relevant. And so thank you so much for the work that you're doing in this area. I think it's really important. I love the idea of creating teams that don't have this. I think as leaders, we can constrain the amount of, shiny objects we run toward and try to complete the ones and get them to market before we can have an impact there. we can't always do that from our place on teams, but we can as leaders.
Mm-hmm.
So I think constraint can actually be a powerful tool in the leadership
Mm-hmm.
in protecting our teams from this kind of burnout. Where can people find you, Brandi?
Yeah, so you can find me at realworkdone.com. That is my learning and organizational design consultancy. And we believe that the best way to design organizations is to get real work done while you're doing it. And that the only place to do good work is in reality. So you'll find a healthy dose of pragmatism and reality in all of my work. So you can find me there. You can find me on LinkedIn, Brandi Olson. You can find my book, Real Flow, at the website. You can also find it on Amazon or anywhere you like to buy books.
Great. And we just had a comment, really, very interesting. So that's great. We love when our listeners comment. We get excited about comments. And anyone's always, welcome to ask questions. Thank you, Brandi, for being here today. We've really enjoyed having you on the show.
Thank you so much, Melanie. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I've learned along the way too. So thank you.
If you'd like to get a digital copy of my book, The Experimental Leader, Be a New Kind of Boss to Cultivate an Organization of Innovators, you can go to www.book.experimentalleader.com and you can get your very own copy for just $4.95. I want this book in your hands, so I've made it really cost effective so that you can start reading it right away. Go now so you can get started today and start to systematically improve your own leadership. It was great talking to Brandi. I really enjoyed our conversation. And as I was thinking about it, I was thinking about a couple of things that are part of my leadership toolkit with people. One is I often, really recommend to leaders that they end meetings when they're done. So, set aside one meeting, every couple of weeks with your team where you check in and you do all of the warmth and things that need to be done. But don't be afraid to schedule short meetings and to get off after 5 minutes or 15 minutes, if that's the period of time to get the work done, so that you don't end up being in a cycle that because you scheduled an hour, you have to stay on for an hour. Be efficient in your meetings, see what needs to be done, and then don't be afraid to say, I feel like we're done. Can we move on now? That's not rude. You don't have to sit through a long meeting. It's okay to finish and recoup your time back. The other thing is, as she was talking about, how many things you can work on at one time, it really made me think of the Kanban process. And Kanban sort of limits you. A Kanban board can make work visible. I talk about it in my book, but there's, it's a Japanese efficiency tool to make work visible. And they often constrain you to having a column for work in progress that they limit you to having only 3 things in progress. I think you need more than one, and I think you may need more than 2 because, for example, if you're reaching out to someone to get information, you're waiting on them. So things might be, you might be in the waiting mode in a project. So you're working on the project, but you're not actively working on the project. But you certainly don't need 20, because if you're working on 20 things, you're not working on anything actually to move it forward and to get throughput or completion with the project. So Trello, Atlassian's product is a Kanban board. There's some other free Kanban boards out there. We used Kanban Flow for a long time. There's just a variety of Kanban boards that you can use if you want to. You can drop them in the chat or make a comment if there's one that you recommend that you use. MS Teams integrates with Trello as well, and it can be a really useful tool. It has been great talking to you today. I love the idea of trying to prevent burnout before it happens by setting your team up well. I hope that this information has been helpful to you. Go experiment.
Thank you for joining us on another episode of The Experimental Leader. We hope you have found value in today's episode because we're dedicated to helping you become the experimental leader you want to be. To access the show notes or learn more about working with Melanie, visit melanieparish.com. Go experiment.